In this video, I want to show you how to sew the various types of seam finishes that I use to refashion clothes. I generally try to match the original seams of the garment I'm upcycling, so a lot of what I do comes from looking at commercially made clothes and trying to replicate their methods using a basic home sewing machine. So let's get started. But first, some terminology. The term seam finish refers to the treatment of the raw edge used to prevent the fabric from fraying. This is what can happen when you don't treat the raw edge. The hem came out of this washcloth, and this is what it looks like after a round in the washing machine. If you want to keep the frayed look, but don't want the fabric to disappear entirely, you can sew a small zigzag stitch to prevent the fabric from fraying past that point. This way, you can have the frayed look on the hem of your jeans without them turning into shorts. A seam is a row of stitches which joins two or more layers of fabric. The term seam allowance refers to the distance from the seam to the edge of the fabric. Various seam allowances are marked on the pressure plate of your sewing machine. In order to sew something with a specific seam allowance, line up the edge of the fabric with the correct guideline and then sew. In this example, I'm sewing with a seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter on the metric scale, which is a common size in commercially manufactured clothes as well. Overlocking or serging is probably the most common seam finish in store-bought clothes. It uses a specialized machine which finishes the raw edges by encasing them in thread. Many home sewists own sergers, but I don't, so I try to simulate it on my sewing machine using a zigzag stitch. If you're finishing a heavy fabric like denim or twill, which is what I'm using here, use the widest zigzag setting and a fairly small stitch length, like 2 millimeters. Then line up the foot with the edge of the fabric so that the stitch drops over the edge. This works great with rigid fabrics and almost looks serged, but can be tricky with lighter fabrics because it can cause the fabric to bunch up. One way around this is to lower the tension. To finish with a zigzag stitch, sew your main seam on the wrong side with the right sides facing. You can sew with whatever seam allowance you prefer, but I often use 3/8 of an inch, which is just a bit wider than the edge of the presser foot, so it's fairly easy to sew. To sew a zigzag stitch where the stitch goes over the edge, position the fabric so it lines up with the right side of the hole in the foot. Sew so that the needle pierces the fabric on the left but goes over the edge on the right side. To avoid bunching, I lowered the tension to 0 and used a width of 5 and set the length to 2, but it's a good idea to experiment with your machine to see what works best for you. Another way to avoid bunching is to place the presser foot between the seam and the raw edge and sew with a medium width zigzag stitch. For this example, I set the tension to 3, the width to 3, and the length to 2. It doesn't look like an overlocked seam, but it will prevent the fabric from unraveling. You can also trim the edge closer to the zigzag to minimize fraying. I use a zigzag stitch to finish seams in tricky situations like curves or sleeves, when I want to use a small seam allowance in order to save fabric, or when I don't have much time. In commercially made clothes, French seams are used in women's blouses and with delicate or sheer fabrics, but they're not as common as serged seams. As you can see, the raw edge is completely enclosed in the fabric, so it looks neat and it's also durable. I like using French seams because they give a nice clean finish and are fairly easy to sew on a home sewing machine. At first, sewing a French seam can seem counterintuitive because you sew the first seam on the right side of the fabric with the wrong sides of the fabric facing each other, which is the opposite of what you'd do with a serged or zigzag seam. I usually line up the side of the foot with the raw edge of the fabric to sew the first seam. Then trim the seam allowance close to the stitches. You can also simply sew the first seam with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, but that requires more skill. Turn the seam inside out and press. I'm just using my fingers here, but for a longer seam, I would recommend using an iron. Sew the second seam 1/4 inch from the ironed edge. To sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance, my presser foot has a groove to use as a guide, but your presser foot might be different. You can also use a wider seam allowance. Here's what the final seam looks like with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and here's another version with 3/8 of an inch. The drawback to French seams is that they can be tricky to sew in tight areas, and curved or angled seams can cause them to pucker. They can also get bulky with heavier fabrics. But they're great for straight seams, and I typically use them to sew the side seams of shirts or skirts. They're also efficient because they use less thread than a zigzag or serged seam. Top stitching isn't a seam finish, but since it's used frequently in commercial clothing, I wanted to explain what it is and how to sew close to the edge because it's a useful skill to have for some of the other seam finishes. Top stitching is when a row of stitches is made on the right side of the fabric and is visible from the outside of the garment. It can be used as a seam, but it can also be used decoratively to keep seams flat, to sharpen edges, or to reinforce the fabric. On men's shirts, many of the seams are top stitched to keep them nice and flat. Since top stitching frequently occurs close to the edge of a fold or a seam, with distances which are smaller than the guidelines on the pressure plate, I usually line up the fold of the fabric with the inside of the presser foot. For an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, I line the fabric up with the inner angle of the foot, and for an even closer top stitch, I line the fabric up with where the angle of the toe meets the foot as a guide. If you want your sewing to blend in with the original garment, my suggestion is to match the thread color and stitch length as much as possible, especially on seams that are visible from the outside. Flat felt seams consist of 2 rows of parallel stitches, and it's what gives jeans their characteristic look. This seam is found on the crotch seam of jeans because it's very durable, and that's the seam that takes the most abuse on a pair of pants. Another place where it's commonly used is on high-quality men's shirts, and I always use it for pajama pants because it's clean, and by that I mean that, like with the French seam, the raw edges are enclosed inside the fabric, but it also lays flat, so it's perfect for sensitive areas. I also use this method to join sections of fabric, which will be seen on both sides, like this skirt I made from leftover fabric scraps. The downside to this seam is that, like with the French seam, it might not work in tight areas or curves, and if you're sewing a heavy fabric like denim, it can get very bulky. In commercial manufacturing, there's a machine which creates flat felt seams by folding and interlocking the sections of fabric, then sewing 2 rows of stitches along the top. And you can simulate this by ironing a small fold on the 2 sections of fabric, then interlocking and stitching them together. But to do this properly requires more skill and more patience than I have. So here's what I do instead. To sew a flat felt seam on a lightweight fabric, place the right sides of the fabric facing each other and sew with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Trim one side down to about half of the original width. Fold the longer seam allowance over the raw edge, iron, then fold the covered seam to one side and iron again. Stitch down the folded edge, and now you have a seam which lays flat and looks neat on both sides. It doesn't have the second row of top stitching like a machine-made garment, but you can add a second row if you want. You can use this technique on heavier fabrics as well, but sometimes denim can get very bulky, and my machine has trouble getting through multiple layers, so I make what I call the fake flat felled seam, and I've seen similar technique used in manufactured garments as well. For a fake flat felled seam, sew 2 pieces of fabric on the wrong side with the right sides facing each other with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Finish the raw edge with a zigzag stitch. Open the seam and press the seam allowance to one side. Top stitch the seam on the right side of the fabric with either 1 or 2 rows of stitches, so the seam lays nice and flat without getting too bulky. I often use this to sew up the backs of jeans because my machine has trouble sewing through the area where the multiple seams come together. When a strip of fabric is used to cover a raw edge, it's called a binding. It's commonly used to finish the raw edges around necklines or armholes, but it can also be used to finish the edges of seams, especially inside jackets where the seams are visible. There are various ways to attach bindings, and this one uses a single seam. For the binding, I used a strip of fabric which was 1 1/4 inches wide. Fold the strip lengthwise so that the 2 sides are offset by about 1/8 of an inch and iron it. Fold one side to the center fold and iron it into place. Fold the second side to the center fold and iron it in place as well. Fold the entire strip in half, making sure that one side is slightly longer than the other, then iron again. Sandwich the main fabric between the 2 sides of the binding strip and carefully pin into place. Sew on the shorter side of the seam binding as close to the fold as possible in order to catch the longer side underneath. To sew a flat binding, which is frequently used in quilted jackets, the concept is the same except that the binding is sewn down. For this example, I used a 1-inch seam binding. Attach the binding to the seam allowance with the right side of the binding facing the wrong side of the main fabric. Fold the binding over the raw edge, then fold the edge down so it lays flat. Iron into place, then sew down as close to the folded edge as possible. Another way to prevent a raw edge from unraveling is to hem it, which consists of folding the fabric over twice and stitching along the folded edge. One way to make a hem is to iron it first. On the wrong side of the fabric, turn up the raw edge and iron it in place. Turn the folded edge up again, iron it again, and sew into place as close to the folded edge as possible. Another method is to make a rolled hem. To sew a rolled hem, fold the fabric over twice and sew along the fold. Keep folding and sewing until you reach the end. This is one of the fastest ways to sew a hem, but it is less precise than an ironed hem, so I use it for smaller hems like those on sleeves. I iron longer hems like the bottom of shirts and skirts because, in my experience, rolled hems get out of alignment after a while, and then I end up with a puckered hem. But you may be more skilled than I am, so experiment and see what works best for you. The reason I spend a lot of time on seam finishes is because I want my clothes to last and to stand up to the abuses of the washing machine. When I'm sewing, I iron everything meticulously, but once the garment is finished, I'm done. throw it in the washing machine and the dryer, and that's it. I'm not professionally trained, so all of this comes from the personal experience of an amateur, but these are some of the techniques which work for me, and I hope this inspires you to refashion your own clothes, because not only are you helping the environment by refashioning and reusing clothes, it's also empowering to be able to customize your clothes to look and fit the way you like. So I hope this helps you with your own refashioning projects. Thanks for watching, and happy upcycling!